I thought I would do a book review as I recently finished a book that I like. It's What a Carve Up by Jonathan Coe. The US edition apparently is called The Winshaw Legacy, which is the name of the book within a book. Both titles are kind of meta because What a Carve Up is the name of a movie, which is a real movie apparently, which is featured in the book, and parts of the book share plot elements with the movie. I guess I'll have to see it to get like the full picture. This is actually like one of the most physically pleasant books that I've ever read. It has just like really like thin pages and they're just really satisfying to turn. I found it in a free box, which kind of is too bad because it's good enough to buy. It was written in the 90s, and after I had read a bit of it, I thought I knew what it was about in terms of plot, and then I looked it up, and the internet was like, oh, this is actually a satire of, like, the British government in the 80s under Thatcher, and, like, the beginning of the Gulf War. So, I hadn't picked up on that yet. I think, it's a little hard as somebody in 2019 who was growing up in the 90s to like read something and be like, yeah, totally, the Gulf War, I remember all of that, especially because I'm American and obviously the book is from a British perspective, but it's still like an extremely entertaining and interesting book, and I feel like it still gives you a lot to think about even though the specific events in the book aren't recent enough that I can remember them. So it's basically about, according to Wikipedia, it's also a postmodern book, which I don't really understand why, but it does go through a lot of different characters and points of view. It's basically about this dude, and he gets the job of writing a history of this really posh family called the Winshaws, and it's also a comedy, by the way, but it's really sad, and it's basically about how each member of this family works in a different industry. Like, one is an arms dealer, and one worked in factory farming, and one is sort of like a Daily Mail-esque columnist. And so I think it's sort of like the book tries to take the different ways that like powerful groups and powerful people were sort of getting what they wanted under Thatcher, and how it affected sort of the country and the everyday person in the world. So he sort of makes that smaller and more entertaining and easier to digest by sort of making it just be each member of this family works in a different industry, and so they all have chapters that are from their point of view and kind of show the different things that they do. It's really funny and entertaining though. I mean, I say this as somebody who would like to read smart books but often doesn't have the attention span to read things that are dry that I probably should have. But this book was just really entertaining and interesting. And so it's about how this guy is supposed to be writing a history of this family, but he starts sort of having a breakdown as he starts to kind of realize like the way that each family member like indirectly affected his life through their actions and the effect that they had on the country. So it's really cool. When I was reading some reviews of it on Goodreads while I was reading it, everybody warned people that the Dorothy chapter, which is about factory farming, was like the most disturbing thing that they had ever read. And I'm glad that I had that warning because it is pretty disturbing. I have been volunteering at the used bookstore, one of the used bookstores that raises money for the public library here. If you have the opportunity to volunteer at a bookstore, I would recommend it because it's really fun to work at a bookstore, but I at least lack the skill set to actually be a good like bookstore employee. But because I'm a volunteer, because we're all volunteers, like you don't really have to be good. So the supervisor, when I'm late, always says, he always makes the same joke, I'm gonna be docking your pay. So yeah, I used a cashier when I was in college, but I just can't help but notice that I've lost any skill for it that I had. I'm a really awkward cashier, and I always feel like I'm going to somehow like mess up people's money or just like rip it in half somehow while I'm handling it. Like handling other people's money is making me really nervous. One of the really fun things about working there is that you can read all the books in the bookstore, and because you're a volunteer, you can take books and you have an indefinite hold. So you can just take books that are for sale and you can just hide them behind the register and you can just have them until you finish them. So one of the books that I read was called Treasure Island! By Sara Levine. I was mostly interested in reading this because I just thought it was cute that it had the title of a different book and it was about that book. So it's about this woman who reads Treasure Island for the first time as an adult and decides that she's like really inspired by it and she wants to be as courageous as the little boy in Treasure Island and have this like adventurous life. In theory, like describing this book now, I'm like, what a cool idea for a book. I didn't really like it as a thing. Like, it's a really good satire, I guess, of the type of person who always thinks that they're doing the right thing and that what they're doing is great, even if they're an asshole. Because basically, like, the woman in the book is just, like, a huge asshole, but, like, has no idea. And just thinks that she's doing something really cool by trying to have an adventurous life. So it's kind of, that's interesting. It makes you nervous that, like, you're actually that kind of person and you don't know. Don't tell me. So I guess what was kind of annoying to read about it is just, you are just like reading in close first person about this person who's a huge asshole for the whole book. I also think that it wasn't very funny. I tend to, since I was reading this over a long period of time, I was also looking up reviews like for the other book, and I guess it's supposed to be funny, and like people were like, I was laughing out loud at this book. I don't really understand why. Like, I think What a Carve Up was genuinely funny, but with this book it felt like, I guess humor is kind of hard to pull off in fiction, you know, in text for me. Like, I'll laugh a lot at, like, TV and movies and stuff, but I don't usually, like, laugh at books. And with this book, it felt like by being funny, they just meant that it was quirky. Like, a lot of crazy stuff happens, and the main character works in this, like, wacky place, and everyone has, like, a wacky name and does wacky things. But, like, I never actually laughed. Like, I don't understand why things just being, like, quirky is supposed to be, like, a joke if it's not actually funny. I don't mean to criticize the quality of the book. Like, I think it's a cool idea for a book, but not everything that is cool is something that I want to read. But that's my rundown. You can decide for yourself if you want to read it. It's probably still there at the bookstore and many other bookstores. While I have been volunteering, ever since I finished that book, I've just been rereading Y the Last Man because we have all of it and nobody ever seems to buy all of them all at once. So every week there's more. There's some Y the Last Mans for me to read. I haven't read this in like 10 years since I was in college. I really loved it then and I really love it now. It's, I think it's pretty well known, but I'll just shill for Y the Last Man if you don't know it. Because there's going to be a TV adaptation pretty soon, I think, although there's been some sort of issue with it, I guess. But, so it's the story of how there's a plague, and everybody with a Y chromosome, every mammal, is killed except for one man and one monkey. And so it's basically about how that guy has to sort of go on the run and, like, hide from people from various governments and organizations who are trying to like get him so they can experiment on him or like use him to continue the human race, because like obviously whichever organization or government gets him will like be the most powerful. And it also sort of is about how, because of the way that society is now, like, you know, if all of the men died, like, you know, in some industries, like there would barely be anyone working there. Or like if there aren't that many like women in political power, you know, it would be sort of like Battlestar Galactica, where suddenly like the president is somebody who, you know, was fairly low ranking because there weren't any higher up women. So, and then like Israel is doing a lot better because it's one of the only countries where there's like a lot of women in the military. So there would still be a lot of people in the military if all the men died. So that's kind of interesting. I love everything about it. I loved it like 10 years ago. And I still think it's just like one of the most satisfying and enjoyable comics ever. I think like now, like some things about it are kind of dated, like the amount that they use the R word, and also sort of like I would say particularly the depiction of trans characters, although like So far, they don't actually show any trans men. They just show women who are trying to pass as men so that they can be sex workers. Also, like, another thing about the book that feels dated to me, maybe I'm wrong, but like, I feel like all the women are constantly like, oh my gosh, I miss getting dicked so much. And like, I'm not really sure that that would happen. I don't know. And but like, I mean, to be clear, I don't, the book overall isn't like a fantasy of like how hot it would be if you were the last man and everyone wanted you. It's just like it occasionally gets to a point where like a woman is like, there's this one female character and she says something like, oh, I haven't hooked up with any other women because it would take a lot more than the death of all the men to make me eat pussy. And it's like, geez, that's not really true. Like, I think everybody would probably be able to get used to it to some degree and not like freak out whenever they saw a dick. Like, I don't really feel like even straight women usually do that now. Maybe I'm just a clueless lesbian, but I think I'm right. So, yeah, I would say the book is like, when they do talk about trans men, they're very awkward about it and they like misgender them. Like, it's cool that the author thought of it and like realized there would still be some men around, but like, it's just kind of awkward. And, but like, I mean, I feel like you can attribute that to the fact that the book is like 15 years old or 20 years old or however old it is. And hopefully it's nothing that can't be fixed like in the TV show. I'm curious to see what they do. And it's also just kind of cool to read anything that has so many female characters who are so diverse. Like, all the heroes and villains and all the other characters are women, except for one person. Or is it? And, yeah, I would recommend it if you somehow have never read Y the Last Man. Those are my reviews. What a carve up. Treasure Island, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Y the Last Man. And, working at the used bookstore as a volunteer, which I would definitely recommend.